Welcome to the State Secrets Podcast. I am your host, Suzanne Kelly, and today we're joined by someone who has really spent decades sort of peeling back the layers of the world's most secretive organizations. He is widely respected among a number of the folks that I work with at the Cipher Brief every day, and that kind of should already tell you the caliber of Gordon's experience. But Gordon Corera was the BBC's longtime security correspondent and one of the foremost chroniclers, in my opinion, of modern espionage. His reporting has really taken him from the corridors of MI5 to MI6 to Washington to Moscow, and then beyond there, always with an eye toward how intelligence work shapes global events. Now, Gordon's latest book, The Spy in the Archive, How One Man Tried to Kill the KGB, uncovers a remarkable Cold War story that what I think is fascinating is that it was hidden in the decades in dusty files. He found forgotten diaries and personal papers. It's a tale of an unlikely recruit, someone who lived an outwardly ordinary life while quietly navigating the shadow world to try to do something that he thought would be a game changer. Gordon Corera is here with us today. Gordon, thanks so much for joining us. It is always a pleasure to talk to you, my friend.
It is always a pleasure to see you too, Suzanne, and always been a big admirer of the Cipher Brief, a great consumer of its writings, and enjoyed coming to some of your conferences as well. So it's great to be here.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. How does it feel to be an author once again? Is this your second or your third book, Gordon? I should know this.
Oh, it's even more than that, I'm afraid. I've done quite a few, about 5 in all. AQ Khan, MI6, Cyber Spies, Pigeons, which is a very obscure one, Russian illegals, and now Vasily Mitrokhin in the KGB.
Gosh, see, I can't even keep up with you. That's how fast you're almost out, Gordon. Well, it's great. This latest one I think is really interesting because it's difficult. You and I both know when you work in this world to find stories that really haven't been told or talked about endlessly or analyzed. And you kind of really walk away with this story with The Spy in the Archive that centers on these long buried secrets that were emerging from personal diaries and archival records. So I'm wondering if we can just off the bat jump right into a great question, which is, what was the single most surprising discovery that you made? And let's set up your character here a little bit, Gordon. Tell us about him.
Yeah, Vasily Mitrokhin. So he was an archivist, a quite quiet, introverted, obsessive archivist, a librarian, if you like, but not for any organization, but for the KGB, the Soviet Union's secret service, and specifically for its first chief directorate, which spied abroad. Now, Vasily Mitrokhin would turn against the KGB, steal its secrets, copy them, and then get them out to the West. And his existence, in some ways, had been known about because in 1999, some of those secrets were published in a book with Christopher Andrew, the great British intelligence historian. But his story, the story of Vasily Mitrokhin himself, had never been told. The story of why he did it, how he did it, and how his archive had been essentially smuggled out of a collapsing Soviet Union, out of Russia, with the help of the British Secret Intelligence Service MI6. So I think that was the story that I wanted to tell for the first time, which was tell the story behind the story about a man, because I realized, and I think this is one of the things that struck me, there's lots of specific revelations there, but actually you could tell the whole story of the Soviet Union's secret police, of the KGB, or as it's often known, the Cheka, which is the kind of the way that the Soviet Union secret police was known then and now, the Chekists being people who worked for it. You could tell the whole history of that in some ways through the eyes of this one man's story, because he'd been the archivist, because he'd worked for them, because he escaped, because he tried to deliver the secrets to the outside world, because he thought through the secrets of the archive he could destroy the KGB. And as we might come to, ultimately, as Vladimir Putin shows, he didn't succeed in that, but he certainly gave it his best shot.
There's so many interesting aspects of this story, Gordon, and just the book alone is so well worth the read. But tell us, how did you stumble onto this? How did you even find out about this?
Well, so the existence of Vasily Mitrokhin was kind of known, and I remember a bit about it coming out in 1999 when it emerged that there'd been this kind of spy who'd been in the archives. But as I said, the kind of idea of what he actually did and how he did it was a bit of a mystery. And even in the in some of the previous books that have been written, they said, well, the story of how he was extracted from the Soviet Union or from Russia and how his files got out, well, that's, still secret. And whenever you're a journalist, and about you, Suzanne, when you hear those words, well, that's still secret, you go, I wonder if, I wonder if I can,
Wonder how secret.
uncover a bit of that. And, the good thing is because actually, unusually, he's actually an acknowledged defector by MI6, unlike lots of others. It was actually possible to get people to talk about him and to kind of try and understand that operation. So, I started particularly trying to understand how MI6 got him out of the Soviet Union, or out of Russia, I should say, which is an amazing story. How, I'm afraid, the CIA missed him because they had a chance to kind of recruit him and they missed it. And then to try and just understand this one man's motivation. Because I don't know about you, but when you're looking at these stories about spies, it is always so interesting is what drives someone to do these crazy things. And what Vasily Mitrokhin did in some ways was mad. It was crazy. It was dangerous. He didn't even have a plan. He was this odd, introverted, obsessive archivist. And yet he did something extraordinary. And so I just found trying to understand the man, why he did what he did, why he took these risks, that I found absolutely fascinating as a journey. And he died 20 years ago. So it was a question really of speaking to people who knew him, trying to find some of the papers, and, kind of records of what he'd said and what he'd done, and then piece it together that way. So there was a kind of that detective element of writing the book, which I always enjoy as well.
Yeah, I always see you that way. Maybe it's just because you're London and you have that beautiful British accent, but I always see you in a trench coat and like dark alleys getting
Not
people to
often.
tell you their secrets. You've got the
I
look.
do my
Gordon. You
best.
definitely have the look. What were some of the ways that you were able to kind of get inside someone's head who's been dead for 20 years? I mean, you mentioned papers. Like, go a little deeper on that for me. Explain how you really felt like you understood what was motivating this man and who he really was. Why someone in a somewhat, I don't know, generic isn't the right word, but a very basic role for the KGB, how would he be thinking about these things and have these aspirations that he had to really do damage to the organization?
Well, it's interesting because there are some quite obscure books. Obscure maybe is a bit harsh, but which he wrote in his last few years of his life. A book called Czechisms, a lexicon of kind of KGB terms.
Mm.
And what's interesting is if you start to read those books and you don't just read his introduction, but you read the footnotes to his introduction, you start to get a really interesting glimpse into this man's mindset.
Mhm.
And one of the things you could see if you read these very carefully is that this was a man driven by an obsession. He was driven by a near spiritual obsession that the KGB was evil, that
Mm.
it was an evil force which had corrupted his country and had, if you like, taken over his country. And I mean, it sounds wild. And also people I spoke to kind of reflected on this, like Professor Christopher Andrew, which is that, he almost saw his enemy as a creature, as a beast. I mean, really, as a beast, with three heads, one head being the KGB, or the Chekists, the Secret Service, another one being the Nomenklatura, the Soviet elite, and another one being the Communist Party. And he saw himself, and you can see elements of this in his writings, as a hero in a Russian folk story, as a peasant hero who was going to slay this beast with a weapon. And the weapon was the truth. The weapon was the files, the secrets which he'd stolen from inside the KGB. And once you start to unlock this and you start to speak to people about it, you realize he was quite an odd person. He was quite introverted. He was quite obsessive. You could see the way he was influenced by dissidents in the Soviet Union. So famously, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote this book, The Gulag Archipelago, showing how the Soviet Union had built this network of labor camps and the terrible things that went into it. He had, I could see from the writings, a real influence on Vasily Mitrokhin. And Mitrokhin wanted to be a dissident like that, but a dissident, a secret one rather than a public one, and a secret one working within the organization that he hated but which he served, and for which he'd once been a true believer, the KGB. And that, I think, is what makes him so interesting. This was not a spy motivated by money. We talk about motivation for spies. There was a bit of grievance because, we can come to it, but he'd been banished to the archives after having kind of failed as a traditional spy.
Mhm.
But it was also, a man driven by ideology and by this kind of obsession with battling this creature, which he saw as feeding off the Russia he loved. I mean, he was a Russian patriot, even nationalist in many ways, but who actually hated what he saw the elite having done to his country. And so I found it was unlocking those aspects of his personality from some of the notes he'd left, from his more obscure writings, because I think he realized some of this sounded a bit weird. And so they weren't put into some of the other books, and people wouldn't talk about them, but they were, because it was kind of weird and he was an odd character. But actually, once you started to unearth those and then talk to people and then follow through some of the kind of leads of where that led you intellectually, of what formed him, you could then gain this picture of a man and why he did what he did.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about how he came on the radar of MI6. And then, if you'd like to, a little bit about how the CIA missed this.
Yeah, sorry. A bit awkward, but sorry, any listeners but it's an interesting story.
We have a few from the agency.
Yeah, it happens. It happens.
Yeah.
So, the crazy thing, going back to his crazy nature, is he turned against the KGB while working as the archivist. He'd then stolen all its secrets, copied them down, but without having actually contacted a Western intelligence agency. So he didn't have a plan of what to do with these files. It wasn't like he'd been tasked by CIA or MI6 to steal secrets. He just done it and buried them under the floorboards of his dacha, his country cottage, without even a plan of what to do. And then he's kind of thinking, he does this for years and years and years, stealing the secrets, without a plan. He retires, still works on his files, writing them up. And then something happens which I don't think he expected, which is that the Cold War kind of ends. The Soviet Union in 1991 kind of falls apart and kind of disintegrates into both Russia and other states which had been the Soviet Union. And at that point, the borders open up, particularly into the Baltic states, which had been independent, which became independent, having been part of the Soviet Union. So he suddenly realizes he can cross into places like Lithuania, and in those countries now are embassies for the US, for the UK, which have been opened up, and the border controls are weak. So he literally he's a walk-in, and he walks in first to the Americans a couple of times, and it's not even clear how many, and basically turns up as this kind of, he's now around 70 years old. He's dressed down. He looks like a tramp deliberately because he doesn't want to draw attention to himself. He's pulling along a kind of shopping bag full of kind of clothes and sausages and things like that. But in the shopping bag are files from the KGB, or copies of them. And he tries it on with the Americans. And it was interesting because I spent a lot of time talking to former CIA people about what had happened. And it's fair to say, often, when things don't go right, no one wants to quite point the finger or admit why. But he tried a number of times and contacted American embassies. And it's a very interesting story. And I mean, the full details are in the book for people who are interested. But there's a mix of things. In one case, someone is interested in him, but that chief of station in the embassy is about to leave. So he hands it over to his successor and says, come back in a couple of weeks. And when Mitrokhin comes back, the successor looks at him and goes, nah, this guy looks like a kind of chancer. There's also kind of policy things going on because this is now the start of 1992. The Soviet Union is over. And in Washington, there is amazingly, remarkably, this view, both at the top of CIA Russia House, but also in the administration as a whole, which is, we're going to make nice with the Russians. We're not going to kind of spy on them as much as we used to. We can get what we need through liaison rather than spying. So we only want defectors who are absolutely proven gold dust. And it wasn't obvious initially that he was. And frankly, there were just so many defectors at that time. There were so many people rolling up to American embassies saying, I've got a bag of secrets, give me $1 million and a house in Florida and I'll give them to you. And people are kind of like, the joke was another drunk KGB colonel. And so Mitrokhin kind of gets lost in that. And so as a result, he then tries the Brits and rolls up at the British embassy in Vilnius in Lithuania. And, it's so interesting because it's chance. I mean, well, good fortune, you could say, because it just happens that at that British embassy in Vilnius, there is a second secretary, a diplomat, not a spy, because there's no MI6 station based there yet, who is a young woman, still in her 20s, but who speaks Russian and speaks very good Russian, and just meets him, because he's a walk-in, and actually thinks, this guy is interesting. There's something about him which is plausible. And so she invites him in, and there's this kind of wonderful exchange where she says to him, would you like a cup of tea? What could be more British? Offering a cup of tea to him. And in return for the cup of tea, he brings out some of these papers, and she can see these look like secrets of the KGB. So it's a very unequal exchange, a cup of tea for the deepest secrets of the KGB. But then suddenly she will get a message back to MI6 in London saying, I think you better get a team out here because this guy looks like the real deal. And, that will then start a process by which MI6 start to meet him in Lithuania over the coming months and assess how serious he is and decide that they're going to get him out.
I think it's difficult for people to really, especially people who don't come from that world of intelligence, Gordon, and many of them because you've covered this so closely for your career, but it's difficult to be able to explain how instinct, how luck, how timing, how all of these things actually do play a role in trying to determine, if someone has something to offer. I think that's such a fascinating story that it was this woman in her 20s, who had this sort of natural curiosity, probably looked at him as like a grandfather type person with stories to tell, and took the time to listen to them too, is fascinating. I'm wondering, was there anything once you started digging in? I mean, this is my favorite question to ask. Was there anything that really surprised you along the way that you thought, oh, wow, wait, the story just took a different turn or went in a direction I didn't see coming, or had some component to help you build out who he was as a person that motivated him that you wouldn't have known? Was there a moment like that during your research for the book?
Yeah, there were a few. I mean, some of the difficult moments where you realize he had some pretty weird views. He had some pretty, I think, not very pleasant views. And I think you start off wanting to think, and it's such a kind of cliche, but you kind of want to think that someone's a simple hero. And then you realize they're much more complicated than that. And and in some ways, they're much more interesting because of that. And he was a very difficult man. He had some views which were, I think would be, way out of line these days. He was kind of very difficult with people. And yet, what I found interesting was the complexity of the man. And also, I found, you can get very interested in, well, what are the revelations about, the KGB and things like that. But actually, the human dynamics of him and his family were fascinating. He had a wife, Nina, who was a very eminent doctor in the Soviet Union and who knew nothing about what he was doing. And then he had a son who was disabled, Vladimir, who he also wanted to get out. And the family dynamics are also fascinating because, his wife doesn't know anything. And then finally, MI6 are going to, try and get him out. And he's got to tell his wife. And he knows if she won't go, he won't go. And he doesn't quite know how she's going to react. And equally, they've got this kind of disabled son who by that stage is in a wheelchair. And MI6 have got to get him out. And the relationship between father and son was deeply complicated. And, and as I discovered at points, deeply difficult, including during the exfiltration. And that I found quite kind of, it's easy, actually the human side of the story, of what it was like as a family and the kind of consequences and decisions people have to make about, defecting, about leaving, about when they tell their members of their family. I found that quite revealing and quite interesting, beyond the kind of, he revealed this about this spy or about this intelligence service, actually. That's the kind of, I don't know, the reality of it, which hits home sometimes.
That's the drama. That's why Hollywood loves these stories, Gordon, because it's that human component and the relationships and the things that are thrown into those relationships that are so difficult to understand and so fascinating. I want to just sort of like turn the bright light on you for a couple of minutes and talk about what it is, Gordon, that sort of motivated you to be so obsessed, I'll use that word, with this world. I mean, in your career, both covering for the BBC, writing all the books you've written, which I'm now up to speed on. What is it about you, Gordon, that has drawn you into this world over the years and that keeps your interest?
Yeah, I mean, like when you're writing about an introverted, obsessive man who spends his life in files, then occasionally, I wondered, is this Vasily Mitrokhin or is it me? Kind of who can get kind of slightly lost in them. Hopefully not quite in the same way. But I spent, yeah, I mean, it's been, a long time covering this world. I guess now more than a quarter of a century, I guess. But actually, I got into it from covering the US. I was started as a young journalist. Actually, I'd lived in the US for a couple of years, been at graduate school out there, and joined the BBC originally kind of researching and working on US politics and foreign policy in the late 90s. And then, and was spending a lot of time out there. And then 9/11 happened. And I think, as for many people, that was the kind of pivotal moment journalistically for me, which kind of drew me from just covering the US to covering specifically national security in that world, and the kind of whirlwind after that of Afghanistan and Iraq and Pakistan and things like that. And then 20 years as a security correspondent for the BBC, where I was very lucky because, it was a great role where you had a front row seat to see the intelligence world kind of grapple with the new realities, not just of counterterrorism, but how far it should be in the public domain, how far should it talk, when should it talk, what should it talk about. And I felt like I had a kind of front row, and I've had a front row seat to that, which has just been absolutely fascinating, and spending a lot of time, but in Washington, but also getting to go to Moscow or to Islamabad and Kabul, and also, watching the UK agencies kind of move occasionally fitfully, from the shadows into the light a little bit more. And so, you just come across these great stories, and I've been lucky enough to do that. And then you kind of go, well, that story will make a great documentary, or that story will make a great book, and and then plow the field. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so much more. I do want to just pick up on that one thing that you said, which is coming into the light a little bit more, because, I've been covering this for 20 years too. And with the CIA, I remember having conversations very early on, like, look, if all you ever say is no comment, all of those bad news stories about all the evil things they're doing inside the building take traction and hold. And they know this, they're incredibly intelligent people. But I started to see a turn and more transparency, more openness, more of an understanding that the people who are running these organizations are people. And doing it for a sense, usually out of deep patriotism. I don't think it matters what country you're in. I think that's always the answer. But when it comes to like MI6, for example, they haven't quite gotten as open as the CIA has, let's just say over the last decade, in terms of, well, first by law, it's very different still there. I think it's only the former chief of MI6 who can even tell you where he actually worked. But do you see that changing in the near future? Do you see sort of the UK following the US trend when it comes to being a little bit more transparent, more open, never about sources and methods, of course, but about the kind of lifestyle, about the things you do for the country, that sort of thing?
A bit, but never quite as much. It is a cultural difference here. And I think, I was at MI6, when was I there? Kind of a month or two ago in the building for Blaise Metrovelli, who's the new kind of chief of MI6. She gave her first speech to about 20 or 30 of us. We're in the room, in the chief's dining room. It was, fascinating. She gave a kind of overview of the threats and, particularly about Russia, and spoke about it. Didn't take any questions, to the, slight frustration of some journalists there who'd like, some of us who'd like to have asked her a few more questions. And then she will kind of, disappear a little bit. And I think there's cultural differences between the US and the UK about secrecy and transparency. There is still an ongoing debate, I think, in Britain about how far there is value to secrecy and mystique, and not oversharing, if you like, which I think, I can see why they think it has some benefits. I mean, operationally, if you speak to British spies, they will say, let's say you're talking about a Mitrokhin today, a Russian who maybe wants to defect, and let's say they're thinking, who am I going to defect to? The British argument will be, if they want money and if they want probably more direct influence, they'll probably go to the Americans. But the one thing the Brits have is possibly more secrecy around who they, what they do, who their agents have been. So, for instance, they don't publicly confirm agents ever. Mitrokhin is a kind of weird, unusual exception because he wrote a book, but they never even acknowledged Oleg Gordievsky was an agent of theirs, even at his death. The chief of MI6 didn't give a speech or say anything about it or tweet about it. And so there is a kind of debate within British intelligence about how to balance, the advantages of a bit of mystique and secrecy with the problems that in the modern world you also need to be transparent. You need to explain what you do and what you don't do. You need public support. You need what they call a license to operate based on people, believing in you and wanting to join you and work for you. And I think that is an ongoing kind of tension in the UK, which has not been resolved. And so I think, we're in a different place from the US. And I think, it's interesting how it's different.
It's fascinating, the cultural differences. Okay, so final question for you, Gordon, before everyone runs out to buy their copy of The Spy in the Archive, which I definitely think you should do. And then I think you should reach out to the Cipher Brief to let us know what you think about the book. But you were in that room with the current head, the new head of MI6, a small group of people. She did talk in that speech, which I think is available on the internet as well, which was fascinating, a lot about Russia, a lot about technology, about where the threat is going. What is your takeaway? What is your assessment of the new chief of MI6, Gordon, and the direction you think she's taking the agency in?
Well, I think what was interesting about Blaise Metrovelli's appointment is she, people obviously focused to some extent on the fact she was a woman, the first woman to lead MI6. I actually think that's not the most important thing. The most interesting thing is the fact that she was an operational officer. And she'd worked most recently running the technology branch, the Q branch, Q as in kind of James Bond's Q of MI6. And it was actually those two things which I think, gave her the edge and make her distinctive, because I think she has worked operations in the Middle East. She spent a lot of time there and been based out there, which I think is important. And she understands how technology is changing spying and the challenges it poses. And I think in a sense that is, what she was signaling is that, Russia is clearly the near-term threat that the UK sees. And very interesting talk, within what she was saying, that, we're in a place between war and peace. Effectively, we may not be at war with Russia, but we are in a kind of undeclared conflict with Russia, fought primarily in the grey zone, in the field of sabotage, in these kind of activities, and in which intelligence is vital. And intelligence agencies are going to be at the forefront of this. And they are going to need certain skills and ways to operate in order to survive. And I thought that was the kind of real takeaway from her message. And I think, it's, for me, going back to the book, Vasily Mitrokhin wanted to destroy the KGB. He didn't. And we now have a former KGB officer in Vladimir Putin running Russia. There is a continuity there of the survival of that aggressive ideology, of the desire to do things, including sabotage, assassination, active measures, influence operations, which is, you can only understand if you know the history of the KGB. And it is very, very present now. And I think particularly in Europe at the moment, it feels very real. There are arson attacks. There is not just espionage, but sabotage going on all the time. And I think that is the kind of that is the reality of what's going on.
Yeah, we call it the gray zone oftentimes here in the US, and there are several names for it, but I think you're absolutely right. And that's where this war, and it is a gray zone war, is being fought. So it's nice to hear her focus on those things too, as the new chief of MI6. Gordon Corera, author of The Spy in the Archive, How One Man Tried to Kill the KGB. I love the cover of the book, by the way. Gordon, thanks so much for stopping by here with Cipher Brief to chat with us on the State Secrets podcast. It's a pleasure to have you. And if I may give a shameless plug for your own excellent podcast, because this is a community, The Rest is Classified, which you host with David McCloskey, who brings a CIA perspective, but also is an author in his own right here in the U.S.
We've got a bit of a British-American thing going on there, which can occasionally get a little bit competitive on our podcast about who did what.
Listen to you, by the way. So thanks so much for stopping by, Gordon. I really appreciate it. It's always great to talk with you, my friend. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you, Suzanne. Pleasure to be with you.